Jonathan Law High School sits in Milford, Connecticut, a suburban shoreline town where violent crime inside a public school was almost unheard of. On the morning of April 25, 2014, the building opened as it always did. Students arrived carrying backpacks, thinking about classes, exams, and, for many juniors, the prom scheduled for that evening. Inside this school, in a stairwell meant only for passing between floors, a fatal act would take place before the school day had fully begun. That morning, Maren Sanchez, 16 years old, arrived expecting to leave later that day to prepare for her junior prom. Her dress was waiting at home. Plans had already been made with friends. Like her classmates, she had no reason to believe the day would be remembered for anything other than a milestone. She never made it to prom. Shortly after arriving, Maren encountered Christopher Plaskin, also 16 and a fellow student. According to police reports and court records, Plaskin had asked Maren to attend prom with him. She declined. What followed took only moments. Inside a school stairwell, Plaskin stabbed Maren multiple times. Teachers responded almost immediately. Emergency services were called. Despite those efforts, Maren Sanchez died from her injuries inside the school. Within minutes, Jonathan Law High School went into lockdown. The prom was canceled. Parents arrived expecting to collect teenagers who would later be getting ready for photographs and dinner reservations, only to bring them home shaken and confused. The violence was not hidden. It did not occur late at night or away from supervision. It happened inside the school, during the school day, in a place designed for safety and routine. The criminal facts were clear from the outset. Plaskin was taken into custody the same day. There was no prolonged investigation, no dispute over responsibility, no unresolved forensic questions. In 2016, Plaskin entered a no-contest plea to murder, accepting conviction without admitting guilt at trial. In 2018, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement. During sentencing, the defense referenced Plaskin's mental health history, including depression, suicidal ideation, and claims that he heard voices. These issues were raised as context, not as justification. The court acknowledged them, but determined that responsibility for Maren's death could not be displaced. Under Connecticut's juvenile sentencing laws, Plaskin may become eligible for parole after approximately 13 years. Eligibility does not guarantee release. It reflects a legal framework that balances punishment with recognition of adolescent development. The criminal case concluded with that sentence. The broader story did not. As the community searched for answers, a critical detail emerged, one that did not alter criminal guilt, but fundamentally changed how the tragedy was understood. Approximately 5 months before her death, Maren Sanchez reported concerns about Christopher Plaskin to school counselors and administrators. According to sworn testimony and civil court filings, Maren told school officials that Plaskin was troubled and that she feared he could harm himself or someone else. These concerns were not casual remarks. They were communicated through appropriate channels and formally documented within the school system. Maren did what students are often encouraged to do. She identified risk and spoke to adults trained to respond. What followed or failed to follow became central to what happened next. Connecticut schools operate under mandatory suicide prevention and intervention protocols. When a student expresses concern about potential self-harm or harm to others, those policies require specific steps: assessment, escalation to trained professionals, documentation, and continued monitoring. After Maren's death, her family filed a civil lawsuit alleging that Jonathan Law High School administrators failed to fully follow these required protocols after her report. The lawsuit did not argue that school officials could predict murder with certainty. Instead, it focused on process, whether the system responded as required once a warning was raised. This distinction matters. The case was not about inevitability. It was about response. Civil accountability unfolded in 2 distinct stages, each addressing a different layer of responsibility. In 2017, the Sanchez family reached a $1.6 million civil settlement with the family of Christopher Plaskin. This settlement addressed personal civil liability connected directly to the act itself. It did not involve the school district or the city. A second, separate legal action followed. In 2019, the City of Milford and the Milford Board of Education agreed to a $5 million settlement with Maren Sanchez's family. This settlement focused on institutional responsibility, not criminal guilt. Crucially, the district vehemently denied wrongdoing. Officials stated publicly that school personnel had followed best practices and that the decision to settle was made to avoid the financial and emotional costs of prolonged litigation. There was no admission of liability and no judicial finding that protocols were violated. The settlement resolved legal exposure, not factual certainty. Together, the two settlements totaled $6.6 million, reflecting two separate accountability paths, individual and institutional. The second case. Prom night is often talked about as one of the biggest milestones of high school. For many, it is one of the last big shared experiences before graduation. But in the spring of 2024, in Helena, Arkansas, a prom night ended in a way no student wanted or expected. What began as a long-planned celebration at Central High School became the starting point for a tragedy that would ripple through the community, the courts, and the lives of many young people. On April 20th, 2024, Central High's prom concluded without incident inside the school's event space. Students danced, laughed, took pictures, and shared moments they had talked about for months. But once the formal portion of the night closed, a new sequence of movement began, one that would become critical in how this story unfolded. As the prom ended and cars pulled away, groups of students began migrating toward planned after-parties. In towns like Helena, where supervised late-night activities are limited, these after-parties serve as the unofficial continuation of the evening. What remains constant in youth violence research is this: structured supervision drops off after formal events end, and the risk environment shifts. Prom itself had authority, chaperones, planned schedules, clear boundaries. After-parties do not. At one such gathering, an after-party held across from a warehouse space near the original prom location, students congregated well into the early morning hours. Music played, groups talked in lapsing rhythms between laughter and quiet conversations. The night had changed from planned event to improvised space. In that transition, the mix of youthful energy, lowered supervision, and accessible exits opened a window where conflict could escalate. Here, authority diminished. School staff had left. Parents expected the evening to be winding down. Law enforcement had no scheduled presence at the after-party. What remained were groups of young adults trying to navigate social pressures late at night with limited visibility and few organized checkpoints. The ride home on foot or in a vehicle was no longer a safe, supervised conclusion to the night. It was the edge of where safety thins out. According to police reports and subsequent court records, the fatal confrontation occurred in the early hours of April 21, 2024, outside that after-party location. 18-year-old Lorenzo Harrison III was present at the gathering. He had graduated from Central High and was celebrating what should have been a memorable night with friends. The situation that led to the shooting is described in charging documents as an altercation involving another young adult present at the party, 19-year-old Dontarius Stevens, who had already graduated from the school. At some point on that early morning, an argument between Stevens and Harrison escalated into gunfire. Harrison was struck and killed. Police responded, and Stevens was taken into custody a short time later. Emergency crews pronounced Lorenzo Harrison dead at the scene. The celebration that had carried the night earlier was replaced by police tape, questions, and shock. News reports from April 2024 documented the arrest, naming Stevens as the suspect and stating that he was charged in connection with the shooting. These reports emphasized the location of the incident outside the after-party, not inside the school event itself, and that the victim and suspect were both connected to the same community. The news of Harrison's death spread quickly through Helena. Friends, classmates, and families who had posted photos from the prom were suddenly confronting an entirely different reality by morning. What had been an occasion marked by caps, gowns, and music became associated with loss and unanswered questions. In the days that followed, community leaders, school officials, and peers expressed grief and offered support to those impacted. One of the immediate conversations that arose was how a night meant for celebration became a scene of violence, not because prom itself causes violence, but because the conditions after the formal event, unsupervised gatherings, high emotions, late-night movements, created a situation where conflict had little structural containment. Local reporting focused on the loss of a young life, a life that had plans and promise, and the shock experienced by classmates who were still processing the normalcy of prom photos just a few hours earlier. The legal system took up the case, and what followed was months of investigation, indictment, and trial. Court records show that Dontarius Stevens was tried for his role in the shooting. On October 3, 2025, a jury in Phillips County, Arkansas, found Stevens guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Lorenzo Harrison. In addition to the life sentence for first-degree murder, the jury also imposed an additional 15 years for a firearm enhancement related to the unlawful use of a weapon. At the time of his sentencing, Stevens was reported to be 21 years old, having aged out of late adolescence but still young by any standard. The sentence handed down reflected the severity of the crime and underscored the legal consequences of carrying and using a firearm during a confrontation. While nothing could bring back Lorenzo Harrison, the conviction provided a measure of closure in terms of accountability. If you enjoy true crime stories that go beyond the headlines, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you powerful cases and deeper investigations. Third case. June 6, 1997. Began as an ordinary Friday night for hundreds of high school seniors gathered at the Garden Manor Banquet Hall in Aberdeen Township, New Jersey. It was prom night, a planned ending to 4 years of routine, expectation, and anticipation. Students arrived in formal wear. Photographs were taken at entrances and tables. Music echoed through the hall as chaperones watched from the edges of the room. For most people there, the night would pass exactly as expected. For one student, it would not. Melissa Drexler was 18 years old, a senior attending her prom alongside classmates and her boyfriend. What no one in the room knew, and what Drexler would later confirm under oath, was that she was pregnant and in labor. According to court records and contemporaneous reporting, the pregnancy had been completely concealed. During her 1998 plea hearing, Drexler told the court she had kept the pregnancy a secret from everyone, including her parents and her boyfriend. There were no preparations, no medical care, and no one aware enough to intervene. At some point during the evening, Drexler went to the women's restroom. Inside a single stall, she gave birth to a baby boy. The act occurred without witnesses. What followed is established through Drexler's own admissions and the investigation that took place afterward. She removed the baby from the toilet, placed him into several plastic bags, and put those bags into a trash can inside the restroom. She then left the stall and returned to the banquet hall. The physical distance between the crime and the celebration was minimal. Drexler rejoined the prom floor. Witnesses later told investigators that she ate a salad, danced with her boyfriend, and requested the song Unforgiven by Metallica from the DJ. Around her, classmates continued the night unaware that a newborn had been left behind just steps away. Later that evening, maintenance staff discovered the infant in the restroom trash can. Emergency responders were called and attempted resuscitation, but the baby did not survive. The discovery immediately shifted the atmosphere of the event. What had been a school celebration became the scene of a criminal investigation. An autopsy would play a central role in what came next. Medical examiners found air in the baby's intestines, a finding investigators cited as proof that the child had been born alive and had breathed. The cause of death was ruled as asphyxiation, consistent with suffocation. These findings became the foundation of the charges filed against Drexler. By the following morning, the events of prom night were national news. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, small moments took on new significance. Earlier in the evening, classmates had noticed blood on the restroom floor. When asked about it, Drexler reportedly explained that she was experiencing a heavy menstrual period. The explanation was familiar and non-alarming. It ended further questions. At the time, no one interpreted it as a warning sign. In hindsight, investigators and journalists would later point to that moment as an example of how concealment can succeed in plain sight when ordinary answers are accepted without challenge. Drexler was arrested and initially charged with murder. The setting of the crime, a high school prom held in a formal banquet hall, captured public attention and shaped early coverage. Headlines emphasized the contrast between celebration and death, and the case quickly became known by a nickname that would follow it for years: Prom Mom. The label was memorable, but it simplified a complex event into something easier to consume than to understand. The legal process moved forward over the following year. Facing the possibility of a murder conviction, Drexler entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors. In August 1998, she pleaded guilty to aggravated manslaughter. The plea acknowledged responsibility for the infant's death while avoiding a trial that would have focused heavily on intent, medical testimony, and competing interpretations of her actions. She was sentenced to 15 years in New Jersey State Prison. Under state law, she became eligible for parole after serving a portion of that sentence. On November 26, 2001, after approximately 37 months of incarceration, Drexler was released on parole. The case had reached a legal conclusion. Its broader implications remained unresolved. Fourth case. The GBI announced the arrest of Channon Brown, a 17-year-old male. Brown was charged with felony murder, multiple counts of aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Because he was a minor at the time of the shooting, authorities limited what personal details could be released. Those charges marked the official beginning of a criminal case, but they came at the end of a night that had already reshaped multiple families and an entire community. By the time the announcement was made, one teenager was dead, 3 others were wounded, and a celebration tied to one of high school's most anticipated milestones had become a homicide investigation. The shooting occurred in the early hours of April 28, 2024, at an after-prom party in Fitzgerald. The formal prom had ended earlier without a reported incident. What followed was informal and unsupervised, the kind of gathering common in small towns after school events. Music played, groups arrived and left. Some attendees were still wearing prom dresses and suits. The environment felt ordinary, even familiar. Shortly after 12:25 a.m., that familiarity broke. Gunfire erupted inside the gathering. When law enforcement arrived, they found multiple victims suffering from gunshot wounds. 4 people had been shot in total. Chaya Polk, age 15, was among them. She was transported to a hospital, where she later died from her injuries. 3 other individuals were wounded and survived, a detail later clarified in official statements from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation after early reports varied on the count. The scene was secured. Emergency responders moved victims out. What had been a private party became an active crime scene. Evidence was collected. Witnesses were separated. Phones that had captured fragments of celebration hours earlier were now documenting the aftermath of violence. Chaya Polk did not attend school in Fitzgerald. She was a student at Irwin County High School, located in a neighboring county. Like many rural schools in South Georgia, Irwin County draws students from small communities where social lines overlap and events extend beyond town boundaries. Prom night connected teenagers from different areas, but the loss that followed rippled back most strongly through her school. Within hours, local law enforcement requested assistance from the GBI. The agency assumed control of the investigation, processing the scene and coordinating interviews. By later that same day, agents identified and arrested Channon Brown. He was charged with felony murder related to Polk's death, aggravated assault for the surviving victims, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. From the outset, investigators were careful in what they confirmed publicly. They stated where the shooting happened, when it occurred, and who had been charged. They did not release a motive. That absence was deliberate. Authorities explained that details surrounding intent and circumstances would remain undisclosed to protect the integrity of an active case involving juvenile witnesses and a juvenile defendant. That silence, however, left a void that facts alone had to fill. There has been no public indication of long-term planning in the materials released by investigators, no statements suggesting a prearranged attack, no evidence shared of advanced coordination. Instead, the case reflects a pattern repeatedly documented in youth gun violence, a firearm present in a crowded, emotionally charged environment, and a moment that escalated beyond control. Criminologists often refer to this as a weapon of opportunity scenario. The defining factor is not weeks of preparation, but immediate access. In spaces where emotions are high and supervision is limited, the presence of a gun changes outcomes instantly. Without it, conflicts may end in arguments, injuries, or police calls. With it, there is no buffer between impulse and consequence. After-prom parties sit squarely in that risk zone. They are transitional events, no longer under school oversight, not fully under adult supervision. Expectations are relaxed. Curfews stretch. Responsibility is assumed rather than enforced. None of these elements make such gatherings violent on their own, but they reduce the margin for error when lethal access is introduced. In Fitzgerald, the setting itself offered no warning. It was not a location already associated with crime. It was not a public venue designed for large crowds. It was a private gathering built on trust. The shift from celebration to catastrophe happened in seconds, not through a visible buildup. The impact was immediate for students at Irwin County High School. Child Polk's death was not abstract. It meant an empty desk, unfinished plans, and a sudden confrontation with loss at an age when milestones are supposed to stack forward, not collapse backward. School officials arranged counseling services. Classmates gathered at vigils. Prom photos circulated alongside memorial posts, forcing joy and grief into the same frame. As the legal process continues, many details remain sealed or undisclosed. Court proceedings involving juveniles move slowly and carefully. Prosecutors have not released further evidence publicly. Investigators have not expanded on motive. What remains fixed is the outcome recorded in official statements. One teenager lost her life, 3 others were injured, and a prom night ended in irreversible harm. If these true crime cases keep you watching, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Your support helps the channel grow and keeps more in-depth investigations coming. The 5th case. The Huntington prom night murders of 2005 remain one of the most devastating unsolved crimes in West Virginia history, not only because 4 young people were killed, but because the violence arrived at the exact moment when the night was supposed to be over. On Saturday, May 21, 2005, students from Huntington High School attended their prom. It was a familiar milestone. Formal clothes, group photos, parents expecting late returns but safe ones. By all accounts, the event itself passed without incident. What happened afterward changed everything. In the early morning hours of Sunday, May 22, 2005, gunfire erupted outside a residence at 1410 Charleston Avenue in Huntington. When police arrived, 4 teenagers had been shot. All 4 died at the scene or shortly after. The victims were Megan Poston, 16, Michael Dillon, 17, Edric Clark, 18, and Dante Ward, 19. The prom was not the location of the crime. The shooting occurred hours later, after the structured event had ended. That separation is central to how investigators have framed the case from the beginning. This was not violence during a school function. It was a mass killing that followed one. Police secured the scene and began what quickly became one of the largest homicide investigations in the region. The location offered limited immediate answers. Multiple victims, numerous gunshots, no confirmed suspect on scene, no weapon recovered. By morning, Huntington woke to a reality that felt impossible to process. 4 young people who had dressed for celebration the night before were now the subject of emergency briefings and breaking news alerts. Families were notified. Friends learned through phone calls that the night they shared had ended permanently. In the days that followed, Huntington High School operated under intense strain. Counselors were brought in. Attendance dropped. Prom photographs circulated alongside memorial notices. The contrast was unavoidable. From the start, law enforcement emphasized caution. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed residents, and appealed to the public for information. Tips poured in. Police confirmed they were following leads both locally and outside West Virginia, but released few specifics, citing the need to protect the investigation. As weeks passed without arrests, investigators acknowledged that while evidence existed, it did not rise to the level required for charges. Over time, police publicly discussed what they described as their strongest working theory. According to investigators, the prevailing belief was that Dante Ward was the intended target of the shooting. Law enforcement stated that Ward was believed to be connected directly or indirectly to a dispute involving a Detroit-based drug network. Under this theory, the other 3 teenagers were not targeted individually but were killed because they were present at the scene. Authorities repeatedly stressed that this theory was investigative, not judicial. No court ever ruled on it. No one was charged in connection with it. Still, it became the explanation investigators returned to most often when asked how 4 young people could be killed in a single attack. Another name surfaced repeatedly in reporting, though never in an indictment related to this case. Police long suspected Sheralethea "Bunny" Holmes of having a role in arranging the shooting. Holmes was later convicted in a separate and unrelated murder-for-hire case, a fact that reinforced investigators' suspicions in the prom night killings. However, despite years of scrutiny, she was never charged in connection with the Huntington murders. When she was granted parole years later, officials confirmed once again that the prom night case remained unresolved. Witness accounts added another layer to the investigation. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots, followed by a female voice pleading for her life in the moments before the final shots were fired. Investigators stated they believed the voice was likely Megan Poston, based on proximity and timing. This belief was derived from witness testimony, not forensic confirmation, and it could not be independently verified in a way that supported criminal charges. The investigation continued into the following years, with detectives reviewing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and tracking tips. Community members organized vigils and reward funds in the hope that someone would come forward with information strong enough to move the case forward. In 2011, additional details entered the public record through court filings unrelated to the murders themselves. Those documents named Shannon Dennis and Jamal Ray as individuals law enforcement believed were involved. According to those filings, Dennis allegedly admitted to driving the shooter, while Ray was identified as the person who fired the weapon. These statements were never tested in a homicide trial. No indictments followed. Prosecutors did not present the evidence to a jury, and investigators acknowledged that corroboration problems and inconsistencies prevented the case from advancing in court. That distinction matters. It is defined by how close the investigation came to explanation without ever crossing into certainty. This is not a story built on a long public trail of threats or visible escalation. There was no confirmed warning issued before the violence. The night had already fulfilled its purpose. The event was over. What followed occurred in a narrow window where structure had dissolved and accountability could not be immediately established. Someone decided in that moment. That decision lasted seconds. Its consequences have lasted decades. The ages of the victims highlight the scale of the loss. Megan Poston was 16, Michael Dillon was 17, Edric Clark had just turned 18, Dante Ward was 19. Different stages of youth ended together. As years passed, local media returned to the case on major anniversaries. Coverage from outlets such as WSAZ emphasized the same facts repeatedly: the victims' names, the date, the location, and the absence of arrests. Each report confirmed that the case remained open. Proms continued at Huntington High School. Students continued to dress for photographs. Parents continued to stay up late. Life moved forward because it had to. The sixth case. Police records show that initial dispatch times are commonly cited at approximately 12:24 a.m. Reports then place arrival and active investigation markers closer to 12:32 a.m. The variation is not unusual in fast-moving scenes, where multiple calls, dispatch decisions, and on-scene assessments overlap rather than occur at a single fixed moment. What remains consistent across official accounts is that gunfire erupted shortly after midnight and that officers were responding within minutes. That response led police to a private residence in the 2900 block of Tip Top Drive near Norris Road in Columbus, Georgia. An after-prom party was underway there, attended by an estimated 100 people. Cars were lined along the street. Groups moved in and out of the house. To anyone nearby, it appeared to be a loud but otherwise ordinary gathering following a high school dance. Within seconds, that changed. Witnesses described a sudden and overwhelming burst of gunfire. The shots did not come one at a time. They overlapped, arriving so quickly that many people could not tell where they were coming from. Later estimates from witnesses and officials suggested roughly 100 rounds may have been fired. When news crews arrived, they observed more than 40 shell casings scattered across the area, reinforcing accounts of sustained gunfire rather than a brief exchange. People ran in different directions. Some ducked for cover, others fled in cars. The party dissolved almost instantly, leaving behind confusion, fear, and silence. In that chaos, 3 people were struck by gunfire. One of them was Bryson Cochran. Bryson was 17 years old. He was a senior at Central High School in Columbus and a multi-sport athlete who participated in track, baseball, basketball, and football. Prom night was supposed to be one of his last major high school milestones. Instead, it became the night his life ended. Emergency responders arrived and began securing the scene. Despite life-saving efforts, Bryson Cochran was pronounced dead at the scene at 1:23 a.m., according to the Muscogee County coroner. He was the only fatality from the shooting. 2 other individuals were also injured. Police later confirmed that both were transported to the hospital and were listed in stable condition. They survived. As details emerged, one fact drew particular attention. Muscogee County Coroner Buddy Bryan confirmed that officers had been at the residence just minutes earlier, responding to a noise complaint. At that time, there were no reports of violence. The gathering was loud, but nothing suggested an imminent shooting. By the time gunfire erupted, officers were no longer present. This detail has often been misinterpreted. It does not indicate misconduct or neglect. Instead, it highlights how rapidly the situation escalated. A routine call about noise transformed into a homicide scene in a matter of minutes. In the immediate aftermath, clarity was hard to find. Despite the size of the crowd, investigators quickly encountered a familiar obstacle: limited witness cooperation. The Columbus Police Department publicly acknowledged that many attendees said they did not see who fired the shots. Some said their backs were turned. Others said they were already running when the gunfire began. Many left the scene before officers arrived. This lack of information was not necessarily driven by indifference. It was driven by confusion, fear, and fragmentation. In large gatherings, responsibility often dissolves. People assume someone else has already spoken to the police. By the time that assumption proves false, critical moments have already passed. Phones rang that night. Messages went unanswered. Parents woke up to news alerts instead of texts from their children. The absence did not arrive all at once. It crept in through silence. As the investigation continued, attention shifted from the scene to the person who had been lost. Bryson Cochran had no publicly known history of criminal activity. Police have never suggested that he was involved in any wrongdoing that night. There has been no indication that he was the intended target of the shooting, and no evidence released publicly has pointed to a personal dispute involving him. Instead, Bryson appears to have been caught in an eruption of violence inside a crowded, uncontrolled environment. His obituary confirmed what classmates and teachers already knew. His life centered on sports, school, and family. At Central High School, grief counselors were made available. Memorials appeared. Jerseys and photos marked his absence. The impact was immediate and lasting. A seat in class remained empty. A uniform went unworn. A routine ended abruptly. The case was assigned to the Violent Crimes Unit. Detectives collected shell casings, reviewed evidence, and attempted to reconstruct what happened during the brief window when gunfire erupted. As of when this video was uploaded, no arrests have been made. Police have confirmed that the case remains an open and active homicide investigation. Investigators have repeatedly emphasized that the primary obstacle is the lack of actionable witness information. Despite the large number of people present, no statements have yet clearly identified who fired the shots. To keep the case from fading from public attention, Bryson's family has offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Police continue to encourage anyone with knowledge, no matter how small it may seem, to come forward. 7th case. At approximately 12:40 a.m. on April 27, 2024, deputies in Orangeburg County, South Carolina, were dispatched to reports of gunfire at a large after-prom gathering near Santee. The party was already underway when the calls came in. Dozens of teenagers and young adults were present. What began as a celebration following a high school prom had escalated into a chaotic and dangerous scene. When deputies arrived, they found Harrison Rollins, age 19, suffering from a gunshot wound. Emergency responders attempted life-saving measures, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. Several other individuals had also been injured, though none fatally. By the time law enforcement secured the area, the night had already crossed a point of no return. The gathering was not held at the prom venue itself. Earlier that evening, students from Lake Marion High School had attended their formal prom event without incident. After the dance ended, many traveled to an after-prom party held at a private residence on Antioch Road, a rural stretch outside Santee. According to reporting confirmed by law enforcement, the homeowner was a mother who had opened her home in an effort to provide a safe space for teenagers to gather and stay off the streets. That intention, however, did not align with what ultimately happened. As more people arrived than anticipated, the gathering grew beyond the homeowner's ability to control it. Deputies later stated that the number of attendees and the lack of formal supervision contributed to an environment where tensions could escalate quickly. At some point during the night, an argument broke out. Authorities have not publicly detailed what triggered the dispute, but they confirmed that gunfire followed. Shots were fired into a crowded area. Panic spread as people ran for cover. In the confusion, Harrison Rollins was struck. Investigators have not stated whether he was the intended target, only that he was caught in the violence that erupted during the confrontation. The sheriff's office emphasized that the presence of a firearm at a crowded youth gathering dramatically increased the risk to everyone there. In the hours immediately following the shooting, the Orangeburg County Sheriff's Office launched a full investigation. Deputies interviewed witnesses, collected physical evidence, and began reviewing digital material. Early statements made clear that the violence occurred at the after-prom party, not at the school-sanctioned event. Law enforcement also publicly acknowledged that the homeowner was not being treated as a suspect, noting that she had intended to create a safer alternative to unsupervised gatherings elsewhere. As the investigation progressed, officials confirmed that multiple individuals were believed to be involved. In the days following the shooting, deputies urged witnesses to come forward and warned that additional arrests were possible. Community concern grew as residents waited for answers, while Harrison's family prepared for a funeral instead of celebrating milestones he would never reach. On May 3, 2024, authorities announced arrests in the case. 3 teenagers were charged in connection with Harrison Rollins' death. The suspects identified were Dion Gaddist, age 19, Montrell White, age 17, and a 16-year-old juvenile, whose name was withheld because of age. All 3 were charged with murder. In addition to murder, prosecutors filed further charges against the suspects, including possession of a weapon during a violent crime and breach of peace of a high and aggravated nature. Law enforcement stated these charges reflected both the use of a firearm and the danger posed to the large number of people present at the gathering. Investigators did not publicly specify which individual fired the fatal shot, explaining that such determinations would be made through court proceedings. Because of the suspects' ages, the case spans both adult and juvenile court systems. Officials emphasized that the legal process would take time and urged the public to avoid speculation. The sheriff's office reiterated that the facts presented publicly were limited to what could be confirmed without jeopardizing the prosecution. As legal proceedings moved forward, the focus within the community shifted toward remembering Harrison Rollins as a person, not just a victim. Friends and family described him as outgoing, caring, and closely connected to those around him. Vigils were held in his memory, and fundraising efforts were organized to support his family with funeral and related expenses. At Lake Marion High School, grief counselors were made available to students and staff, coping with the loss of someone they had seen just hours earlier at prom. The legal process continues. 8 case. According to sworn testimony and official police findings, the shooting that killed Darius Bryant was driven by an ongoing rivalry between gangs associated with Talbotton and Manchester. Investigators were clear on this point in court. The violence was not the result of a random dispute, nor a sudden argument that spun out of control in isolation. It was connected to a broader conflict that had existed long before prom weekend and had already produced tension, threats, and prior confrontations. That context matters because it reframes everything that followed. What happened that night was not spontaneous. It was the collision of a long-standing rivalry with a crowded, emotionally charged weekend where young people moved freely between locations. Law enforcement testified that the rivalry set the stage. The shooting was the outcome. What the motive does not establish, however, is guilt by association for the victim. From the very beginning, Darius Bryant's family has been firm and consistent. Darius was not affiliated with any gang. His father has stated publicly and repeatedly that his son was an innocent bystander, present in a space shaped by conflict, but not a participant in it. This distinction sits at the center of the case. The motive explains why violence occurred, but it does not explain why a 16-year-old who, according to his family and school community, had no gang ties, lost his life. Darius Bryant was a Manchester high school student in Columbus, known for athletics and for living an ordinary teenage routine. Prom weekend in April 2024 was supposed to be a milestone, not a risk factor. Like many high school students, he was navigating a moment associated with celebration, independence, and transition. Late on the night of April 20th, 2024, just before midnight, gunfire broke out near the intersection of Macon Road and Lakeshore Drive. The shooting did not occur during the prom itself and did not take place on school property. As is common on prom weekends, the night continued after the formal event ended. Groups moved between locations. Supervision thinned. Tensions that already existed followed the crowd. When police arrived, 2 teenagers had been shot. Darius Bryant was rushed to Piedmont Columbus Regional. In the early hours of April 21st, 2024, shortly after midnight, he was pronounced dead. He was 16 years old at the time of his death. Another victim, Clarence Favors, underwent surgery and survived. The timeline carried a detail that would later take on emotional weight. April 27, 2024, the following Saturday, would have been Darius's 17th birthday. His family emphasized this repeatedly, noting how close he was to another milestone. His funeral was described as a fourth-quarter celebration, language drawn from sports to reflect both who he was and how abruptly his life ended before reaching that final stretch. In the immediate aftermath, the investigation moved quietly. Manchester High School made counselors available, vigils formed. Classmates returned to classrooms where one absence was impossible to ignore. Early media reports reflected limited information. No arrests were announced. The Columbus Police Department asked the public for help as detectives began reconstructing the night. Witnesses described seeing tension earlier in the evening. An argument had occurred. Voices were raised, people noticed, but nothing was reported at the time. That detail initially drew attention, but later police testimony clarified its role. Investigators did not treat the argument as the cause of the shooting. Instead, they framed it as one visible moment within a larger and already volatile rivalry. In an environment shaped by ongoing gang tensions, conflict had become familiar enough that warning signs no longer demanded immediate response. This normalization of aggression became part of the story. Not because it excused what happened, but because it explained how danger could move through a public space without interruption. When conflict becomes expected, intervention feels optional. Responsibility diffuses across a group. Silence fills the gap. For more than a year, the case remained active but largely out of public view. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements. To the outside world, the investigation appeared stalled. To the family, time passed in markers that carried weight: birthdays, graduations, sports seasons, each one highlighting who was missing. The case shifted dramatically in July 2025. On July 3, 2025, police made the first arrest. Zion Horton, 17, was taken into custody in Coweta County and charged with murder in connection with the shooting. The arrest confirmed that investigators had identified suspects and were prepared to move forward. On July 7, 2025, Samaj Copeland, 18, turned himself in to authorities. Days later, during court testimony on July 10, 2025, investigators identified Copeland as the alleged driver involved in the shooting. That testimony revealed one of the most painful details of the case. Samaj Copeland is Darius Bryant's cousin. The revelation collapsed any remaining emotional distance between victim and suspect. The violence had not only crossed community lines, it had cut directly through a family. What was already a story of loss now carried an added layer of rupture, binding grief and accountability into the same circle. The investigation continued to advance. On July 21, 2025, police arrested Jaquan Mahone, 20, in Talbotton, Georgia. With that arrest, 3 suspects were in custody. According to court records and testimony, all 3 suspects face identical charges: murder, 3 counts of aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a crime. The charges reflect not only the death of Darius Bryant, but the broader danger created when gunfire erupted in a public area. The 9th case. Jacqueline Gomez was 17 years old on the night of May 16, 2014. She was a high school senior in Houston, Texas, attending her prom, an event framed by weeks of planning and the expectation that the night would be remembered for photos, music, and the quiet relief of reaching a milestone. Friends described the evening as normal. Nothing about the early hours suggested that by morning, Jacqueline would be gone. Jacqueline attended prom with her date, Eddie Herrera, who was 20 years old. The event was held at a hotel in North Houston. After the formal dance ended, many students remained at the hotel for post-prom gatherings. This transition, from a supervised public setting to private rooms, became central to the case. The hotel room Jacqueline went to after prom was not booked by Herrera himself. Trial testimony established that it was booked by his mother, Melissa Ann Martinez. Prosecutors later emphasized that her involvement went beyond logistics. Evidence showed that Martinez provided the teenagers with alcohol, specifically 2 bottles of whiskey and a significant quantity of prescription medication, approximately 20 hydrocodone pills. Those substances would later appear in toxicology results and become a major point of contention at trial. In the early morning hours of May 17th, Jacqueline and Herrera were alone together in the hotel room. What happened during that time was not witnessed by anyone else. According to Herrera's later statements, the two engaged in sexual activity. During that encounter, he applied pressure to Jacqueline's neck. Herrera would eventually claim that Jacqueline asked him to do so. Prosecutors disputed that explanation, pointing to medical testimony showing that neck compression is inherently dangerous and can cause rapid oxygen deprivation even without visible injuries. At some point, Jacqueline became unresponsive. What followed did not involve an immediate call for help. Testimony and phone records presented at trial showed that approximately 2 hours passed after Jacqueline was found unresponsive before emergency services were contacted. During that period, Herrera and his mother did not call 911. Instead, according to prosecutors, Martinez assisted Herrera in dressing Jacqueline's body. Hotel staff, rather than Herrera or Martinez, ultimately contacted emergency services. By the time paramedics arrived, Jacqueline had suffered catastrophic brain injury caused by lack of oxygen. She was transported to the hospital, but doctors determined that the damage was irreversible. She never regained consciousness and was later pronounced dead. The delay in seeking medical help became one of the most critical factors in the case. Investigators initially faced a complicated picture. Toxicology tests showed that Jacqueline had alcohol and hydrocodone in her system. The defense would later argue that these substances played a major role in her collapse. Medical experts, however, testified that drugs and alcohol alone did not explain the extent of her injuries. They explained to jurors how strangulation can restrict blood flow to the brain, leading to rapid loss of consciousness and permanent damage within minutes. The uncertainty surrounding the exact cause of death contributed to the pace of the investigation. Herrera was not arrested immediately. In fact, he was not arrested until 8 months after Jacqueline's death. During that time, investigators reviewed medical findings, witness statements, phone records, and Herrera's own accounts of the night. Those accounts were not consistent. Initially, Herrera told police that he and Jacqueline had fallen asleep and that something went wrong while they were sleeping. He did not mention choking. As the investigation progressed, his story changed. He later admitted that he had applied pressure to Jacqueline's neck during sex. Prosecutors highlighted this shift at trial, arguing that it reflected an attempt to minimize responsibility once evidence became unavoidable. The case moved forward without a murder charge. Prosecutors acknowledged that proving intent to kill would be difficult given the circumstances. Instead, they charged Herrera with aggravated assault, arguing that he knowingly engaged in conduct that posed a serious risk of bodily injury and that Jacqueline's death resulted from that conduct. Under Texas law, aggravated assault can carry severe penalties when serious injury or death occurs, even without intent to kill. The role of Herrera's mother was addressed separately. Melissa Ann Martinez was charged for providing alcohol and prescription drugs to minors and for her actions following Jacqueline's collapse. Prosecutors argued that her decisions, booking the room, supplying substances, and delaying emergency medical care, contributed directly to the fatal outcome. They emphasized that the 2-hour delay represented a window during which Jacqueline might have survived had help been called immediately. Martinez later pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 21 months in jail for her role. At trial, jurors heard detailed testimony about the delay in calling for help. They reviewed phone records and heard from hotel staff. Prosecutors argued that panic did not explain 2 hours of inaction. The defense countered that fear, confusion, and shock influenced decisions that night. They maintained that the encounter between Jacqueline and Herrera was consensual and that her death was the result of a tragic combination of substances and unforeseen medical complications. The jury rejected that framing. Medical experts testified that strangulation, even when described as brief or controlled, can be lethal, particularly when combined with depressant substances. They explained that loss of consciousness can occur quickly and that permanent brain injury can follow within minutes if oxygen deprivation continues. In 2016, Eddie Herrera was found guilty of aggravated assault. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The verdict reflected the jury's conclusion that Herrera's actions constituted a violent assault that directly contributed to Jacqueline Gomez's death, regardless of whether he intended that outcome. 10th case. The conflict began over a missing cell phone. Witnesses testified that Devontae Hackett, who was also 18, was accused by another teen of taking the phone. The exchange became heated. The person confronting Hackett felt threatened and uncertain about how the situation might escalate. What mattered, according to every major account later heard in court, is that Brandon Vulpi was not originally part of this dispute. Vulpi, also 18, was nearby with friends during the early morning hours of June 7, 2014, after prom celebrations across Ottawa had already ended. The gathering outside Les Suites Hotel on Besserer Street was informal and unsupervised. Teenagers were arriving, leaving, and lingering in clusters. Voices rose and fell. Tension moved through the crowd without a clear focal point. When the argument over the phone intensified, Brandon Vulpi stepped in. Witnesses consistently described him as a blameless bystander who intervened only to help a friend who felt unsafe. He was not accused of stealing anything. He was not escalating the conflict. His role was brief and protective, an attempt to calm the situation and reduce the sense of threat rather than increase it. The attempt failed. During the confrontation, Devontae Hackett produced a knife. What followed occurred in seconds. Medical testimony later presented at trial made clear that Brandon Vulpi sustained multiple sharp force injuries, not a single blow. The fatal wound was a deep stab to the chest, penetrating approximately 10 centimeters and reaching the heart. In addition to that injury, Vulpi suffered a 17-centimeter slash to the neck, cutting down to the trachea and jugular vein. He also sustained cuts to his face and arms, injuries consistent with defensive movements as he tried to protect himself. Emergency calls were placed immediately. Paramedics arrived quickly and transported Vulpi to the hospital, but the injuries were catastrophic. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The death was ruled a homicide. In the immediate aftermath, Hackett did not stay at the scene. While police identified him as a suspect rapidly, he fled Ottawa. Investigators issued a Canada-wide arrest warrant, and Hackett was not taken into custody until July 2014. When he was located and arrested in Toronto, nearly a month after the killing. His absence during that period became part of the factual record, reinforcing the seriousness with which investigators treated the case. Hackett was charged with second-degree murder. Under Canadian law, this charge does not require proof of planning or premeditation. The legal question is whether the accused intended to cause bodily harm that he knew was likely to result in death. The prosecution's case focused on the nature of the weapon, the number and placement of the wounds, and the context in which the violence occurred. The trial began in 2017. Jurors heard testimony from eyewitnesses who had been present outside the hotel, as well as forensic and medical experts. Surveillance footage from the area was introduced, along with physical evidence tying Hackett to the confrontation. The Crown argued that the use of a knife in a crowded, emotionally charged situation demonstrated the required intent for second-degree murder. The defense did not dispute that Brandon Vulpi died during the confrontation. Instead, defense counsel focused on intent and evidentiary limitations. They emphasized that the knife used in the stabbing was never recovered and argued that available video footage did not clearly show the charges stayed under the Jordan framework, citing alleged delays in bringing the case to trial. That application was denied. The judge ruled that the length of proceedings did not exceed constitutional limits once the complexity of the case and defense-related delays were taken into account. The trial proceeded to verdict. After deliberation, the jury found Hackett guilty of second-degree murder. At sentencing, the judge imposed the mandatory penalty required by Canadian law, life imprisonment. The remaining issue was parole eligibility. The court set parole ineligibility at 12 years, meaning Hackett would not be eligible to apply for parole until that period had passed. This outcome was reported in detail by CBC News. It is important to understand how that sentence functions in practice. In Canada, parole ineligibility for second-degree murder is calculated from the date of arrest, not the date of sentencing. Because Hackett was arrested in July 2014, his earliest opportunity to apply for parole falls in July 2026. Eligibility does not guarantee release. The Parole Board of Canada conducts a comprehensive risk assessment and may deny parole repeatedly. Even if parole were granted at some point, the sentence itself does not end. A life sentence in Canada is literal. Hackett would remain under Correctional Service Canada supervision for the rest of his life, subject to strict conditions and immediate reincarceration if any condition were violated. This case may be over, but the questions it raises can last a lifetime. If you want more true crime stories that keep you up, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.